it seemed that I would be the one that would play him because nobody else was doing my songs, and the chances of my actually getting a musical.
For decades, the dynamic between David Bowie and Mick Jagger has lived somewhere between myth and reality. Their chemistry was undeniable, but no one could quite define it. Then came a claim from Angie Bowie that pushed the story into a different light entirely. She didn't speak in rumors or theories. She described a moment she says she witnessed herself. And if her account is true, it may explain why their relationship always felt like something more. The darkness before stardom. Before the world ever met Ziggy Stardust, there was just David Robert Jones, a regular kid growing up in London, living what looked like a pretty normal life. His father worked for a children's charity, his mother Peggy waited tables, and from the outside, nothing really stood out. It felt like the kind of quiet, everyday upbringing you wouldn't expect to produce a global icon. But beneath that surface, there was something heavier sitting in the background. Peggy came from a family marked by serious mental health struggles. That wasn't just a passing issue, it ran deep. Biographer Mark Spitz once described schizophrenia in the family like a curse, something that lingered in the bloodline. And the reality with conditions like that is they don't always show themselves right away. Sometimes they stay buried until life hits hard enough to bring them out. For Peggy and her siblings, life hit hard more than once. First, there was their mother, Margaret, a woman many described as unstable and harsh, someone who created a tense, loveless environment at home. Then came the Blitz during World War II, when London lived under constant threat of bombings. Imagine growing up with that kind of fear hanging over you every night. That kind of pressure didn't just shake the city, it shook people mentally. By the time David came into the picture, that history hadn't disappeared. It lingered in the atmosphere around him. Inside the household, warmth wasn't exactly overflowing. Margaret wasn't known for being affectionate. In fact, even her own daughter described her as cold, the kind of person who kept love at a distance. And it didn't stop there. Two of Peggy's sisters, Nora and Vivian, began showing signs of schizophrenia early on, with their conditions getting worse during the war years. So while David's childhood might have looked ordinary from the outside, there was always this quiet tension underneath. And as he grew older, that reality started to weigh on him. He couldn't ignore what he was seeing in his family. At some point, the thought crossed his mind. What if that same fate was waiting for him? That fear may have shaped more than people realized. Some believe his constant reinvention, the way he moved between identities, wasn't just creativity, it was control. A way of breaking himself into pieces on his own terms before anything else could do it for him. Still, if you looked at young David early on, nothing immediately screamed superstardom. He was just another kid in 1950s England. But it didn't take long for people to notice. There was something different about him. By the time he was 6, teachers were already pointing him out. He was bright, clearly gifted, but not quiet about it. He had a streak in him. A little rebellious, a little confrontational. The kind of kid who didn't just blend into the background. As he got older, that energy only grew stronger. Around 9 years old, his teachers were already amazed by his dancing. They described him as vividly artistic, someone with a natural poise that didn't match his age. It was like he had something inside him that needed an outlet. It just hadn't fully found its direction yet. That spark didn't come from nowhere. A major turning point came when his father brought home a stack of American records. That moment shifted everything. These weren't just songs, they were a whole new world. Artists like Elvis Presley and Little Richard weren't just making music. They were creating energy, attitude, presence. And for David, Little Richard hit different. Hearing Tutti Frutti wasn't just exciting, it was overwhelming. He later described it like hearing something divine, like music had suddenly opened a door he didn't even know existed. From that point on, there was no turning back. Music wasn't a hobby anymore. It became part of who he was. By the end of the 1950s, he was already experimenting with instruments, picking up whatever he could: ukulele, piano, even a homemade tea-chest bass. He threw himself into performing, channeling the energy of the artists he admired. Even as a kid, when he performed for his local group, people noticed. There was something about him that didn't feel ordinary, something hard to explain, but impossible to ignore. And while music was shaping him, another major influence was right there in his life: his half-brother, Terry Burns. Terry's story carried a lot of pain. Born under difficult circumstances and raised by a grandmother who was both emotionally and physically abusive, he grew up dealing with trauma that never really left him. Over time, that trauma developed into serious mental health struggles, including schizophrenia. But to David, Terry wasn't defined by that. He was the cool older brother, the one who introduced him to new ideas, new sounds, new ways of thinking. Terry opened the door to things like jazz, beat poetry, and the kind of art that pushed boundaries. Even though he came in and out of David's life, his influence stuck in a big way. David admired him deeply, but he also saw the reality of his condition up close. And that added another layer to the quiet fear already building in the back of his mind. Then came a moment that would physically mark him forever. As a teenager, David was close with his friend George Underwood. They did everything together, until things got complicated over a girl. It started like typical teenage drama, but it didn't stay small. After a misunderstanding, one that David played a role in, George lashed out. The punch wasn't just a quick scuffle. His fingernail caught David's left eye, causing serious damage. At first, it didn't seem like something that would last, but it did. Doctors managed to save the eye, which was a huge relief. But the injury left permanent damage to the muscles, causing his left pupil to stay fully dilated. The condition, known as anisocoria, gave his eyes that striking, uneven look the world would later become fascinated by. At the time, though, it wasn't about image or mystique. It was just another moment in a life that was still far from the spotlight. By his mid-teens, it was already clear that David's ambition was moving at a completely different speed from everyone around him. At just 15, he started his first band, the Conrads. For most kids, that would have been enough, but for him, it wasn't even close. He could already see something bigger, something none of the others seemed to understand. And that gap in vision, it frustrated him. So he didn't wait around. He moved on. Next stop was the King Bees, and this time he wasn't playing small. He was locked in, determined to make something happen, even if it meant dragging the whole situation forward himself. And in a move that said everything about his mindset, he decided to reach out to someone at the top. He wrote directly to entrepreneur John Bloom, basically asking him to do for his band what Brian Epstein had done for the Beatles. It was bold, maybe even a little unrealistic, but it showed exactly how he saw himself. Bloom didn't take the offer, but he didn't shut the door completely either. He connected David to Leslie Kahn, who stepped in to help promote his first single. Still, even with that push, the King Bees weren't giving him what he needed. So once again, he made the call to leave. That became a pattern. He moved on to the Manish Boys, this time with a clear vision in his head. He wanted to be their version of Mick Jagger. Frontman energy, swagger, presence. But no matter how much he pushed, the band just didn't have the spark to match what he was trying to build. So he kept it moving. The next stop was the lower third. On paper, it looked like it might finally click, but in reality, it was just another step in the same cycle. Close, but not quite right. While all this was going on, while he was bouncing from band to band, chasing something he couldn't fully grab yet, his personal life found a bit more stability. In 1964, he met Dana Gillespie, a young actress and songwriter. He was 17, she was 14, and despite how chaotic his life already was, they built a connection that lasted for years. They weren't just a couple, they were creative partners, moving through that period together. But even with that steady presence, his career hit a different kind of obstacle. He had a name problem. Up to that point, he'd been performing as Davy Jones. The issue was, there was already a well-known Davy Jones out there fronting the Monkees, and in an industry where identity is everything, that kind of overlap could bury you before you even get started. So he made another calculated move. He let the old name go and went searching for something sharper, something that would stand on its own. That's how David Robert Jones became David Bowie. The name came from James Bowie, a 19th century American frontiersman known for the Bowie knife, a heavy, unmistakable blade built to cut through anything in its path. That idea stuck with him. He wanted a name that felt just as direct, just as cutting. Something that could slice through noise, confusion, expectations, and once it clicked, it stuck. By 1966, he officially stepped into that identity. Not long after, he released a single under the new name while still working with the lower third. But when it failed to make an impact, he didn't hesitate. He walked away again. For the next stretch of time, he kept moving, playing with different groups, trying different sounds. Nothing really landed. So by 1967, he made another shift, this time stepping away from bands completely to go solo. He released his first album, a self-titled project that didn't hold back. It jumped between styles, pop, experimental sounds, psychedelia. It was all over the place in the best way. But the problem was, the world hadn't caught up yet. People didn't know what to do with it. The album failed, and after so many attempts that didn't connect, it forced him into a real moment of reflection. For the first time, he started questioning whether the issue wasn't the music, but himself. That's when things took a deeper turn. Around that same time, he started searching for something beyond music, something that could give his life direction. His half-brother Terry had introduced him to Buddhism, and it hit a nerve. Not lightly, either. David didn't approach it as a phase. He went all in, seriously considering leaving everything behind to become a monk. That search led him to Chame Rinpoche, a Buddhist teacher. When David first met him, he took the moment as a sign, like he had finally found what he was looking for. For a while, he fully leaned into that path, studying and trying to reshape his life around it. But it didn't last. Rinpoche saw something David couldn't see yet. He understood that this wasn't the right road for him. The discipline, the stillness, it didn't match who he was at his core. And eventually, he guided him back toward the one thing that always made sense: music. That moment didn't instantly fix everything, but it reset his direction. It pushed him back into his purpose, this time with a clearer understanding of himself. And as he moved forward, that honesty started to show, not just in his sound, but in how he presented himself to the world. By the early 1970s, he wasn't just experimenting with music anymore. He was challenging identity, gender, and expectations. In 1972, he openly spoke about his sexuality, later clarifying that he was bisexual. At the time, that wasn't just personal expression, it was risky. Even though laws had started to shift in 1967, homosexuality in Britain was still heavily restricted and stigmatized. Public expression could still carry serious consequences. So when he stepped out the way he did, it wasn't just about style, it was a statement. He wasn't trying to lead a movement. He wasn't trying to represent anyone. He was just being himself. But in doing that, he ended up pushing boundaries for everyone watching. Still, back in 1967, none of that had fully come to the surface yet. His identity, his struggles, his questions, they were all still forming behind the scenes. At that point, it was still private, still something shared only within his close circle. When art turned into obsession. By 1967, David Bowie stepped into a moment that would quietly reshape everything about him. That's when he met Lindsay Kemp, a dancer and performer whose influence would reach far beyond the stage. Bowie signed up for classes at the London Dance Centre. But this wasn't just about learning how to move. It was about learning how to communicate without saying a word. Kemp introduced him to something deeper. Movement wasn't just motion, it was emotion, control, presence. Every gesture had meaning, every pause had power. It gave Bowie a whole new way to connect with people, one that would later define the larger-than-life characters he became known for. But the connection between them didn't stay strictly professional. There was a natural pull between the two from the start. Kemp had already been drawn to Bowie's music, while Bowie was fascinated by Kemp's theatrical way of living. To him, Kemp wasn't just an artist on stage. His entire life felt like a performance. That kind of energy left a mark. For a while, their relationship became this intense mix of art, emotion, and attraction. But when two strong personalities collide like that, it rarely stays balanced for long. The age gap between them was there, but that wasn't the real issue. Bowie's restlessness caught up with him again. His inability to stay committed eventually broke things apart, especially after Kemp discovered he had been involved with someone else. Even with that fallout, they didn't completely separate. They kept working together, and in a way, that mattered more in the long run. Kemp's influence stayed embedded in Bowie's approach to performance. That idea of image, of using the body as part of the storytelling, it stuck. And through Kemp, Bowie's life shifted again. In 1968, he landed a role in a BBC production called The Pistol Shot. Kemp was involved in choreographing part of it, and that's where Bowie met Hermione Farthingale. She was a dancer, and from the moment they connected, it was clear something was there. The relationship moved quickly. They became close, started building a life together, and for a moment, it looked like Bowie had found something stable. But history repeated itself. By early 1969, Hermione left for Norway to work on a film, and the relationship came to an end. Bowie didn't try to dress it up or shift the blame. He knew exactly what had gone wrong. His pattern of infidelity had caught up with him again. Still, the impact of that relationship didn't disappear. Hermione stayed in his mind, influencing his music and shaping the emotional space he was working in at the time. And right after that chapter closed, another one opened. Fast. In 1969, Bowie met Mary Angela Barnett through a mutual connection. What started as a relationship quickly turned into marriage. By March 1970, they were already husband and wife. But this wasn't some ideal love story coming together. From the beginning, it was complicated. By Angela's own account, the marriage was more practical than romantic. It served a purpose, particularly in helping her secure the ability to work. There wasn't much illusion about what it was. Even Bowie himself didn't frame it as some deep emotional bond. It was a partnership, but not the kind built on stability or traditional expectations. Living together reflected that reality. Their home life was intense, unpredictable, sometimes chaotic. They kept the relationship open, which, given Bowie's track record, may have been the only way it could function at all. Still, there was a connection between them that went beyond convenience. That much was clear when they had a son together, Zoe Bowie, who would later become known as filmmaker Duncan Jones. While his personal life stayed complicated, his career still hadn't found its footing. Behind the scenes, Bowie was developing. His time with Lindsay Kemp had sharpened his understanding of performance and identity. He was learning how to build a presence, how to shape himself into something more than just a singer. He was also writing for other artists, seeing some success that way. But as a solo act, he still wasn't breaking through. It became harder to ignore. His own material wasn't landing, while others found success with things he created. That kind of frustration builds, and eventually, it forces a decision. Bowie reached a point where playing it safe wasn't an option anymore. The traditional path wasn't working, so he started leaning into experimentation. Different sounds, different styles, different approaches. He tried everything, searching for something that would finally connect. For a long time, nothing did. Then came the shift. Instead of chasing what might work, he turned inward. He took all the confusion, the setbacks, the emotional weight from his relationships and his career, and poured it into a single idea. That idea became a story about an astronaut named Major Tom. That song, Space Oddity, changed everything. When it was released, the timing couldn't have been better. It came out just days before the Apollo 11 launch, and suddenly, the world was looking toward space. The song tapped directly into that moment. It connected. It climbed into the UK top 5. It gave Bowie his first real breakthrough. For the first time, his name started to stick, but even then, it wasn't a straight path forward. Success came, but it didn't fully settle things. The industry didn't suddenly open every door. It still took time, years actually, before he would hit that level again. In 1970, he released The Man Who Sold the World, and it marked another clear shift. The softer, acoustic sound from earlier work gave way to something heavier, more aggressive. It was a different side of him, one that leaned into rock with a sharper edge. And visually, he was evolving just as much. The album's UK cover showed him in a dress, leaning fully into an androgynous image that challenged expectations. At the time, it could have been controversial, but instead, it drew attention in a different way. Critics and audiences didn't reject it. They were intrigued. He didn't treat it like a one-off statement either. He carried that look into interviews, into public appearances, making it part of his identity rather than just a visual experiment. And people noticed. There was something about the way he presented himself, confident, different, unapologetic, that made it hard to look away. It wasn't just style for the sake of shock. It felt intentional, like he was building towards something bigger. Looking back, that moment feels like a turning point. Not the peak, but the setup, because the pieces were starting to come together. While out on tour for the album, David Bowie hit a creative spark that would change everything. Somewhere between the lights, the noise, and the constant movement, he started imagining a new kind of figure, one that fused the raw edge of Iggy Pop with the cool, poetic energy of Lou Reed. What he was chasing wasn't just another stage persona. He was trying to build the ultimate pop idol. Bowie had never been shy about pulling inspiration from the world around him. In his mind, it wasn't about who did something first. It was about who could take it further. And that's exactly what he did. By 1972, the idea had fully taken shape. Bright, almost alien costumes. Hair dyed a striking reddish brown. A presence that didn't feel human. That was the moment Ziggy Stardust was born. Ziggy wasn't just a look, it was a whole experience. Bowie stepped on stage with his band, the Spiders from Mars, presenting a character who felt like he had dropped straight down from another planet. Behind the scenes, there was real anxiety. The people around him had no idea how audiences would react to something this strange, this different. But the second the performances began, that fear turned into disbelief. The shows hit hard. They were theatrical, unpredictable, and completely unlike anything else happening at the time. Bowie didn't just gain fans, he built something closer to a movement. What followed was often described as a cultural wave that reshaped music and identity at the same time. And when Starman landed, any doubt disappeared. Bowie had officially crossed into another level of fame. But the thing that made Ziggy so powerful was also what made it dangerous. Bowie didn't treat the character like a role he could step in and out of. He lived it. On stage, he wasn't David Bowie pretending. He was Ziggy. That separation gave him freedom, but it didn't hold for long. Over time, the lines started to blur. The switch between who he was and who he performed became harder to control. Ziggy followed him off stage, into interviews, into everyday life. The character stopped being something he could turn off. It lingered. It stayed. The performances themselves only made it worse. Every night was intense, chaotic, almost unhinged. Living inside that kind of energy took a toll. Bowie later admitted that the character stuck with him far longer than he expected, to the point where he began questioning his own sense of reality. Eventually, it became clear that something had to give. After a year of fully living as Ziggy, Bowie made a sudden, dramatic move. In July 1973, on stage at the Hammersmith Odeon, he shocked the audience by announcing his retirement. Just like that, the era ended. The band split, and Ziggy Stardust was put to rest. But Bowie wasn't walking away from music. He was searching for his next form. By 1974, he had moved to the United States, chasing a new sound and a new identity. The success followed him, but mentally, things were heading in the opposite direction. His lifestyle spiraled, and what started as partying turned into something far heavier. His health declined, and the pressure began to show. By the end of that year, he released a live album from the Diamond Dogs tour, but behind the scenes, he was barely holding it together. He would later joke that the project should have been titled to reflect how fragile his state really was. Even as his career kept rising, his grip on stability was slipping. Out of that chaos came another transformation, the Thin White Duke. Unlike Ziggy, this wasn't just a performance. It was deeply tied to where he was mentally and physically at the time. Heavy drug use, especially cocaine, became a constant presence, pushing him into long stretches without sleep while keeping his creativity alive. Those around him saw both sides. His guitarist, Carlos Alomar, described how Bowie could stay sharp and focused for days, but cracks would appear. Sometimes he would forget lyrics mid-performance, forcing quick adjustments on stage just to keep things moving. The deeper issue wasn't just the exhaustion, it was what the drugs were doing to his mind. The effects began to mirror the mental health struggles that had already existed in his family. What he had once tried to outrun now seemed to catch up with him in a different form. Things reached a darker level during the filming of The Man Who Fell to Earth. Bowie later described intense hallucinations and a distorted sense of reality. Around this time, he also made a series of controversial public statements that would follow him for years. Looking back, he admitted he wasn't in control of himself during that period. The lowest point came during the station-to-station era. Public appearances became unpredictable, and incidents like the one at Victoria Station turned into major controversies. Combined with unsettling interviews, it painted a picture of someone who was unraveling in real time. By 1976, he had reached his limit. He left everything behind and moved to West Germany, bringing Iggy Pop with him. The goal was simple: get clean and rebuild. That period would go on to produce what became known as the Berlin Trilogy, a creative reset that helped him regain control. When he returned to touring with the Isolar 2 World Tour, it marked a major shift. For the first time in years, he was performing without relying on substances. He was clear-headed, focused, and present in a way he hadn't been in a long time. Still, personal struggles didn't disappear overnight. His marriage to Angie Bowie had already been under strain, and by 1980, it officially ended. He took custody of their son, Duncan Jones, stepping into a new phase of responsibility. At the same time, his career entered one of its strongest periods. The 1980s saw him reach massive commercial success, peaking with Let's Dance in 1983. He collaborated widely, expanded into film with Labyrinth, and continued building on the legacy he had started years earlier. Then, in 1990, something shifted in his personal life. He met Iman, and this time, it was different. Their connection was immediate, and by 1992, they were married. Together, they built a more stable chapter of his life, eventually welcoming a daughter. Even with that stability, Bowie never stopped evolving. His beliefs, his identity, his perspectives on life, everything remained fluid. Religion, politics, and especially his sexuality were topics he revisited and redefined over time. Early on, his openness made headlines, but later, he reflected on how complicated that public exposure had been, especially in different cultural contexts. By the early 2000s, he had settled into a more balanced view. He no longer felt the need to represent anything beyond himself. At his core, he saw himself simply as an artist, a performer who wanted the freedom to create without being boxed in. And in the end, that's exactly how he moved through the rest of his life. Constantly changing, constantly searching, but always grounded in the one thing that never left him: the music. On January 10th, 2016, just 2 days after turning 69 and releasing his final album, Black Star, David Bowie was gone. The news landed like a shockwave. Even those closest to his work hadn't seen it coming. He had kept his cancer diagnosis so tightly guarded that, to the outside world, it felt sudden, almost unreal. And that's what made it even more striking. In his final weeks, Bowie wasn't retreating. He was still creating. In fact, he had been quietly recording demos for 5 new songs, catching even his longtime collaborator, Tony Visconti, off guard. Just a week before his death, Bowie told him he wanted to push forward. One more album, one more chapter. But time didn't stretch far enough. Visconti would later reflect on it in a way that felt almost poetic. Bowie lived exactly how he chose, and in the end, even his passing seemed to follow that same philosophy: deliberate, expressive, and on his own terms. What he left behind wasn't just music. It was a layered, almost cinematic legacy. He took deeply personal struggles, especially the history of mental illness within his family, and transformed them into art. Through ever-evolving personas, he gave form to things most people couldn't even put into words. He challenged norms long before it was widely accepted, reshaping conversations around identity and self-expression in a way that still echoes today. And behind the scenes, he fought his own battles, most notably overcoming a heavy drug addiction to eventually find a sense of clarity and peace in both life and art. So when Black Star arrived, it didn't feel like just another album. It felt like a final statement. a carefully crafted closing note to a life that had never followed the rules. Bowie's ex-wife confirms she caught him in bed with Mick Jagger. Now, when it came to David Bowie and Mick Jagger, their connection was never simple. On the surface, it looked like pure showmanship. Loud, stylish, attention-grabbing. Two larger-than-life figures feeding the spotlight. But behind all that flash, there was something more complicated. They moved like brothers, but not in a comfortable, easy way. There was tension there, something layered and hard to define. Bowie clearly looked up to Jagger in the early days. In a conversation with William S. Burroughs, he described Jagger in a way that caught people off guard, less like a typical rock frontman and more like a controlling, almost nurturing presence. It was admiration, but expressed in a way that made people raise an eyebrow. Jagger, on the other hand, didn't just sit back and accept the praise. By 1974, he was already throwing a little shade, questioning how long Bowie would last, and hinting that he understood Bowie on a deeper, more unsettling level than most. Still, that influence showed up clearly. Bowie's 1973 album Aladdin Sane carried that same chaotic performance philosophy Jagger lived by. The idea that the only shows that mattered were the ones that pushed into madness. But over time, things shifted. The dynamic flipped. Jagger started watching Bowie differently, almost studying him. Bowie had this ability to reinvent himself over and over, changing identities like clothes, while Jagger largely stayed rooted in who he was. That kind of transformation sparked a mix of fascination and quiet envy. Then came 1985. The two finally teamed up for Dancing in the Street, a high-energy duet tied to the Live Aid movement. On the surface, it looked fun, spontaneous, even a little chaotic. But underneath, it felt like something else, almost like they were playing exaggerated versions of their own dynamic. The chemistry in that video didn't go unnoticed. There was a tension there people couldn't quite explain, something that blurred the line between performance and something more personal. And the world couldn't get enough of it. The song shot straight to #1 in the UK and cracked the top 10 in the US, while the video, directed by David Mallet, was everywhere. Off-stage, their connection only added to the mystery. According to biographer Christopher Anderson, the two were nearly inseparable for a time, whether it was showing up together at the Muhammad Ali versus Ken Norton fight, partying at London's Tramp Club, or losing themselves in the crowd at a Diana Ross concert. They moved like a unit. People noticed how close they were, sometimes unusually close. Stories from people around them only fueled the speculation. Ava Cherry, one of Bowie's backing vocalists, spoke openly about being part of their private world, describing moments where she felt more like an observer than a participant. Bebe Buell shared similar experiences, recalling late-night invitations that hinted at a very open, unpredictable lifestyle. Then there's the moment that really locked this story into rock folklore. In 1973, Angie Bowie claimed she walked in on Bowie and Jagger together in bed. Her reaction was almost casual, like she had stepped into something unexpected, but not entirely shocking. To her, it didn't feel like some deep, emotional romance. It felt more like the messy aftermath of a wild night. And that's really where the mystery sits. Depending on who's telling it, the story splits in two directions. One version paints it as nothing more than two rock stars caught up in the excess of the era. Long nights, blurred lines, and zero boundaries. The other sees it as something more deliberate, where identity, sexuality, and attention all blended into a kind of performance art designed to keep the world watching. Either way, what Bowie and Jagger had wasn't simple, and it definitely wasn't ordinary. It was part friendship, part rivalry, part spectacle, and it kept people guessing the whole time.